They assigned me the Miro estate the same day I finalized my divorce. I remember the moment vividly, not because it felt significant, but because it felt cruelly routine, like the universe had decided that if it was going to let me fall, it might as well kick me on the way down. I was sitting at my desk at the firm, surrounded by the gray buzz of photocopiers and the stale smell of break room coffee, when an email pinged into my inbox. Review and audit of assets, Miro estate, effective immediately. No one even looked up when I muttered a bitter laugh. That's the kind of place it was. No one noticed when your life ended in pieces, as long as you met your deadlines. I was already halfway hollowed out by that point, my personal life shredded by years of silence, resentment, and finally absence. My wife, ex-wife now, had once said I buried myself in paperwork, so I wouldn't have to face real life. And maybe she was right. But at the time, I believed that if I could just keep everything perfectly accounted for, everything labeled and reconciled, then the chaos outside wouldn't touch me. Numbers made sense. People didn't. So, when the Miro estate file landed in my lap, I treated it like every other job, impersonally. Just another half-forgotten property tangled in a century's worth of probate limbo. But something about the name stuck with me, even before I looked at the file. Miro, it had that cold, distant echo, like saying a name into a cavern, and hearing your own voice thrown back at you, slightly warped. The estate was in Linvale, a town so small it wasn't on most modern maps. I had to search through dusty county directories just to confirm its existence. A place frozen in time, swallowed by trees and silence. I was given a week's hotel stay and the task of cataloging the remaining assets, reviewing historical tax records, and confirming title ownership. Standard stuff. Yet no previous audit had ever been completed. My supervisor, Collins, handed me the file with a look I couldn't quite read. Somewhere between indifference and relief. "No one wants to touch that place," he muttered. "You're thorough. You'll get it done." That was all. No backstory. No red flags. Just a ghost assignment handed off to the man most likely to say yes out of apathy. I drove to Linvale the next morning in a rental car that smelled like pine-scented despair. The highway curved endlessly through farmland, each town growing smaller until storefronts gave way to broken windows and gas stations with hand-painted signs. When I reached Linvale, it was dusk. The sun had dipped low behind a wall of pines, and the air felt oddly still. I found the estate after missing the turn twice, a winding gravel road choked with overgrowth, like the forest was trying to reclaim it. The house was barely visible from the road. 3 stories of stone and slate, hidden behind a curtain of gnarled trees. The windows were dark. No lights, no warmth. It didn't look abandoned so much as it looked exiled. When I stepped out of the car, the air smelled like damp earth and old smoke. The lock on the front gate had rusted through, and the path to the door was broken by tree roots that cracked the stones underfoot. I stood there a long moment, hand on the iron door knocker shaped like a lion's head, wondering, not for the first time, what the hell I was doing with my life. Then I knocked. The sound echoed like a memory through the empty halls. No one answered. Of course not. There hadn't been a Miro resident in decades, according to file. The house was owned in trust by the county, pending final estate resolution, which was why I was here, to close the book, wrap the ledger, file the death. I stepped inside, and the door groaned behind me like a living thing. The air inside was colder than outside, thick with the scent of mildew and time. Dust lay over everything like ash after a fire. The entry hall stretched wide, with twin staircases curling up into darkness. Portraits lined the walls, grim, heavy-faced men and women with eyes that watched you no matter where you stood. I felt a prick of something. Not fear, not yet, but discomfort, that bone-deep sense of stepping into a place not meant for you. I set up my temporary workspace in what must have once been the drawing room. The furniture was draped in sheets like bodies at a crime scene. I began the audit that night. Old deeds, purchase receipts, ledgers dated back to 1852. The records were detailed but not organized, and as I flipped through them, an unease began to build. Not from what I found, but from what was missing. Whole years were skipped. Key documents had been tampered with, dates overwritten, pages removed. It wasn't just neglect. It was intentional. And though I didn't know it then, that was the first thread. The first pull in a fabric so tightly woven with silence and deception that unraveling it would take everything I had left. But that night I didn't know. I was just another man, trying to bury his broken life in someone else's forgotten past, not knowing that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. It waits that I started the actual audit the following morning, waking up in the suffocating quiet of the estate's east guest room. The kind of silence that rings louder than noise, the kind that reminds you you're alone in a place that forgot what company feels like. The windows were streaked with grime, and light barely filtered into the ivy-choked glass. I brewed instant coffee from a tin I'd packed out of habit. There were no stores in Linvale open past sundown, and sat at the long mahogany dining table that now served as my makeshift command center. The documents were spread in piles, some crumbling at the edges, others bound in brittle leather, each stack representing a decade of transactions, purchases, property deeds, and taxes. I approached it mechanically at first, as I always did, sorting by date, checking for consistency, cross-referencing known market values against recorded expenditures. But by mid-morning, I began to feel it again, that twitch of unease just beneath my skin, the feeling you get when something refuses to make sense no matter how much logic you throw at it. It started with the tax records. Between 1878 and 1889, the estate had ballooned in value nearly tenfold. There were large purchases, parcels of land in neighboring counties, investments in the railroad, even some stakes in mining operations several states away. But none of these acquisitions had any formal registration. The amounts were recorded in the Miro family's internal ledgers, with full transactional entries. But when I tried to cross-verify them against county land ownership databases, I hit blank after blank. It was as if the money had gone out, but nothing had ever come back. More curious still were the signatures. Several of the documents listed Horace Miro as the executor of funds, but they weren't consistent. Some were crisp, practiced flourishes with a recognizable loop at the tail of the W, but others looked almost forged, jerky, awkward imitations of the same name. I knew the signs. I'd been in this business long enough to recognize when someone was trying to impersonate an authorizing party, and these signatures all came within a cluster of 2 years, 1887 to 1889, the last recorded years before the ledger stopped altogether. It wasn't just financial mismanagement. It was concealment, intentional, careful, desperate concealment. I paused more than once, caught in the feeling that someone else had stood here, at this very table, asking the same questions, thumbing through the same brittle pages, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to line up. There was something deliberate about the disorder. The gaps in records weren't random. They formed a pattern, a triangle of missing time and paper that pointed to something central, something cut out. And the deeper I dug, the stranger it got. The estate was allegedly maintained by a family trust until 1901, at which point the trusteeship was passed to a local law firm that dissolved during the Great Depression. But there was no paperwork for that transfer, no receipt, no legal handoff, no notarized declaration. The ledger simply changed hands in the span of 2 pages. A new header appeared in different ink, different handwriting. Trust oversight to Barker and Lowe. And that was it. I searched every database I had access to, and no such firm ever existed in Linvale. It was like finding a chapter in a book written by a ghost. The more I worked, the more I began to understand why no audit had ever been completed here. This wasn't just an estate. It was a vacuum of truth. Every time I uncovered a lead, it ended in fog. I took to mapping the inconsistencies on a whiteboard I brought from the car, drawing out timelines, marking connections with red lines like some obsessive and conspiracy thriller. And the scariest part was, the more I mapped, the more it looked intentional. This wasn't incompetence. This was design. The Miro family had meticulously crafted a ledger that functioned like a labyrinth, a dead end for anyone hoping to understand where the money went who benefited, or why the estate had remained frozen in legal limbo for over a century. Late that afternoon, I found a bundle of receipts tied with twine, buried beneath a drawer false bottom in the old roll-top desk. They were dated between 1885 and 1888 and listed payments made to individuals identified only by initials, JP, MR, SG, with line items that included courier discretion, witness retraction, and special retainer, confidential. These weren't normal business expenses. These were payouts. Bribes, if I had to guess. And none of them were filed in the primary ledger. I felt the burn of adrenaline creep into my throat. That sickening rush of realizing you're not just looking at old books anymore. You're looking at evidence. Real, buried, and forgotten by everyone except whoever went to such great lengths to make sure it never surfaced. And here I was, tearing off the bandages with clumsy hands. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on a mattress listening to the house creak and sigh around me, feeling the weight of all that paper, all those lies, pressing down from floors above. I thought about why someone would go through all this trouble. Why hide wealth? Why silence records? Who benefits from a court order that was never filed? I remembered Colin's face when he handed me the file. That look wasn't indifference. It was guilt. He knew. Or at least, he knew enough to know this was radioactive. And he'd pass it to me like a hot coal, smiling with relief as it left his hands. My phone barely had reception out here, but I tried to email myself some scans of the documents, just in case. I didn't trust paper anymore. The thought made me laugh, bitterly. I didn't trust much of anything. The next morning, I went into town to get coffee and see if anyone at the courthouse had any record of the Miro audits. The woman at the records desk was polite, but useless. Most of our records from before 1920 aren't digitized, she said with a shrug. And a lot were lost in the flood back in '53. I asked her if anyone had ever tried to resolve this state. She gave me a look that was hard to read, like she wanted to say something but had learned long ago to keep her mouth shut. Not that I know of, she said finally. But then again, some things get lost on purpose. It felt like a line rehearsed, like she'd said it before. I thanked her and walked out, but the words stuck with me all the way back up the winding road to the estate. Lost on purpose. I began to suspect that the Miro estate wasn't just forgotten. It had been buried, intentionally, meticulously, and possibly by more than just a family. This was bigger than probate. This was history rewritten. Truth erased, a ledger crafted not to reflect reality, but to obscure it. And I was the first one in over a century foolish enough to think numbers couldn't lie. The road back into Linvale felt narrower the second time, as though the trees leaned in just a little closer, their limbs draped in moss like the twisted robes of mourners. I drove with the windows cracked open, letting in the dull hum of crickets and the faint scent of wood smoke, anything to shake off the dust and unease that clung to me after another night combing through the Miro ledgers. I'd reached a point where facts no longer felt like lifelines. They were weights, pulling me deeper into a mystery I hadn't asked for but couldn't walk away from. And so, in the absence of paperwork, I turned to the next logical source: people. Linvale was small, tight-knit, the kind of place where newcomers stand out like oil on water. Main Street was a lazy curve of shuttered shops and one operating diner, Merriweather's. Its faded awning the only sign of business amid rows of faded brick. I went in for coffee and conversation, though I suspected I'd only get one. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, drawing a glance from the woman behind the counter. She looked to be in her 50s, sharp-eyed and trim, with hair pulled into a practical bun, and a wariness in her posture that told me she'd spent a lifetime hearing things she'd been told not to repeat. I ordered a coffee and tried to sound casual. "I'm working up at the Miro estate," I said, watching her face. "Audit job. Long overdue." Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A brief hitch in her movement as she poured, a narrowing of her eyes that didn't match her forced smile. "That's so," she said, sliding the cup across. "Didn't know anyone was still bothering with that place." I nodded, pretending not to notice. "Place has a long history. Records are a mess. I figured someone around here might know more." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached under the counter and pulled out a receipt book, scribbling something down without looking at me. "Not much to know," she said finally. "Old money, old secrets. That's how it usually goes, isn't it?" It was an answer that sounded like an end, not a beginning, and the message was clear. Don't ask. I left a tip and lingered in front of the bulletin board near the door. Flyers for lost dogs, church socials, a few community alerts. But one stood out, a faded photo of a man young, early 30s, wearing a county clerk's badge. Missing David Lang, last seen January 1997. I snapped a quick photo of it, and as I did, I saw the waitress watching me in the reflection of the glass. Her eyes didn't blink. I spent the rest of the day walking the town, trying to strike up conversations with shopkeepers and locals under the pretense of small talk. The responses were consistent. Stiff politeness, vague deflections, and sudden changes in topic whenever the Miro name came up. It was like asking about a scar no one wanted to admit was there. At the general store, an older man's stocking shelves glanced up when I mentioned his state. "Some things are better left alone," he said, not unkindly, but with finality. "That place has its own gravity. People go digging. They tend to lose their footing." When I pressed for details, he feigned a cough and retreated into the back room, leaving me standing there with a can of beans in my hand, and a question I didn't know how to stop asking. I began to wonder if this was how the last auditor, assuming there had been one, had felt. A creeping sense of suffocation, not from any overt threat, but from silence itself. Silence can be a weapon when it's shared by enough people. By late afternoon, I was at the town library, a squat brick building that smelled of old paper and resignation. The librarian, a soft-spoken man named Harold, seemed surprised when I asked for archives on the Miro family. "Don't get many requests about them," he said, leading me to a back room where the microfiche was kept. Most of their records were removed years ago. Donated or destroyed, hard to say. That was curious. Public families usually had some form of local legacy, news clippings, dedications, even scandals, but the Miros were a vacuum. I scrolled through what little there was, a few society column mentions from the 1880s, a charity ball in 1876, and then nothing. The family vanished from public view, just as the ledgers did, as if they'd never existed. "You ever meet anyone from the Miro family?" I asked Harold. He paused, considering. "Not directly, but there were rumors about one of them sticking around long after the house was abandoned. Used to hear about lights in the windows, back in the 50s. People said someone was living there off the books. Might have been a caretaker, might have been one of them. Them? The Miros. Or what was left of them. I don't think anyone really knew, or wanted to." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. It wasn't fear I saw in his eyes. It was weariness, like the memory of a weight he'd once carried and quietly set down. Back at the estate, I found myself walking the perimeter at dusk, the light slanting gold through the trees, the air thick with the chirr of cicadas. I passed what might have once been a greenhouse, now collapsed under ivy, and a stone bench split in half by frost and time. The estate felt less like a property and more like a mausoleum, every corner holding the imprint of lives that had folded in on themselves, sealed off by secrecy. I found myself talking out loud, half joking, half serious, as if expecting the house to answer. "What happened here?" I said to no one. The wind rustled the leaves in response, and I laughed bitterly. The next morning, I visited the Linvale Historical Society, a one-room museum run by a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Abernathy, who looked at me over the tops of her glasses like she was measuring my soul. When I explained why I was in town, she grew uncharacteristically quiet. "You know, young man, some people believe that place carries a curse," she said finally. I raised an eyebrow. "I don't believe in curses." "Neither do I," she said, "but I believe in guilt, and guilt can rot a place just as surely as termites." She handed me a faded pamphlet from a town centennial event in 1980. It listed sponsors, civic donors, founding families. The Miros weren't on it, not even a footnote. "They weren't erased from history," she said. "They erased themselves. There's a difference." I thanked her and left with a growing knot in my stomach. The entire town operated like a body protecting an old wound. Scar tissue grown over facts, over names, over memories too dark to cleanly sever. The Miro estate wasn't just a mystery. It was a secret held by everyone and spoken by no one. And I, in my ignorance, had started picking at the scab. That night, I reread the receipts I'd found, try to match the initials to town records, anything that might give me a connection. And then I remembered the missing person flyer. David Lang, clerk, vanished in 1997. That wasn't long ago. Not by this town's standards. I cross-referenced county employee records and found that David Lang had indeed worked in the property division of the courthouse. His last case file? Probate hold, Miro Estate. He'd been reassigned to review potential liens and unclaimed assets. He disappeared 3 weeks later. No body, no leads, just gone. I sat back in my chair, the house around me whispering in its old bones, and realized that I was not the first to chase this thread. I might not even be the second. But the question that kept me awake the rest of the night was, would I be the last? It was nearly midnight when I found the journals, the kind of hour when silence begins to take shape, pressing down on your shoulders, whispering that you've gone too far, stayed too long, asked too much of places that never want to be disturbed. I had returned from another fruitless trip to the county clerk's office, where even the smallest requests regarding the Miro estate were met with clerical confusion, dead ends, or suspiciously vague denials. Every search for records yielding missing, misplaced, or unavailable at this time. The pattern was too clear to ignore now. Someone, or more likely some group, had been erasing pieces of this history long before I ever set foot in Linvale. And yet, the deeper I fell, the more I understood that the answers weren't going to come from outside the house. They were here, somewhere in this decaying monument to concealment. That night, something in me broke. Fatigue, frustration, and a growing sense that I had to know what happened, not just for the audit, not even for justice, but because I was beginning to feel a grotesque kinship with the estate itself, a once purposeful thing hollowed out by time and silence. I went back into the study, a room I'd only briefly skimmed during my initial walkthrough. It was choked with shadows, its bay windows blackened by decades of grime, the bookshelves packed tightly with volumes ranging from law texts to dusty encyclopedias, their spines curled inward like fists. My flashlight beam caught on something odd in the far corner, a shelf that didn't quite match the others. It was lighter, less aged, and the grain ran against the rest. I ran my hand along the edge and felt a seam, barely noticeable, but definitely there. My heart thudded. Quick, hungry, afraid. I pressed, and with a faint groan, the panel gave way. Behind it, a recess. Inside, wrapped in old cloth and secured with a leather strap, were 3 large books, journals, I realized from the weight and shape of them. I pulled them out carefully and laid them on the desk. The air around me felt denser, like I'd stepped into a different atmosphere. The first page of the top journal was dated March 5th, 1886, written in tight, slanted handwriting. "This house will outlive me," it began. "But whether it will outlive my name, I do not know. I record this not to be remembered, but to ensure that I am not mistaken." It was signed, Horace Miro. I sat there, barely breathing, as I turned the pages, each entry drawing me deeper into mine, a man slowly collapsing under the weight of his own legacy. Horace had been the last true owner of the estate, and as I read, it became clear that his family's wealth wasn't merely inherited. It was constructed, coerced, and ultimately stolen. The early entries were dry, detailing meetings with bankers and lawyers, land deals, quiet payoffs to keep certain information from reaching the papers. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The language became urgent, confessional. He wrote of a court petition filed in 1889, one that, if granted, would have revoked the Miro family's claim to nearly half their assets, property they had illegally acquired through manipulated wills and forced signatures. The estate, he admitted, should have gone to a family called Willard, distant cousins who had been systematically cut out of the inheritance through forged documents and legal threats. "It was never supposed to last," he wrote. "We bought time, not truth, and now the truth has found its feet." I paused, staring at the page, my pulse thick in my ears. He had known. All of it. The fraud, the coercion, the complicity of court clerks, and even local judges. He wrote of meetings held in secret, of ledgers altered under candlelight, of entire families paid to forget what they knew. "There are no ghosts in this house," he wrote in one chilling line. "Only men who buried their shame beneath floorboards and called it tradition." I turned to the second journal, and the descent continued. Horace's writing grew more frantic. He spoke of sleepless nights, of hearing footsteps when no one else was home, Not hauntings, but watchers. People sent to ensure silence. I believe I am being followed, he wrote. Not by spirits, but by those who wish to see this house sink into rot without a single word uttered. He became paranoid, convinced that even his own staff had been bought by others, loyal not to him, but to continuation of the lie. He tried to send copies of the court order to legal offices in the capital, but the packages were intercepted. His lawyer vanished during a trip to deliver documentation. A clerk who had agreed to testify was found dead, an accident, the paper said. But Horace did not believe in coincidence anymore. The moment you try to tell the truth, you find yourself alone, he wrote, and the house begins to feel like a coffin. The third journal was the shortest and most disturbing. It was dated late 1889 and ended abruptly. The last entries were written in an unsteady hand, and much of the ink was smudged, as if by trembling fingers or water damage. I have sealed the order, the final entry read, hidden where only the eyes that understand guilt will find it. If you are reading this, then you already know no justice can come from silence, and no silence comes without cost. There was no signature, no farewell, just a final page filled with empty lines, as if Horace had expected to write more, but never did. I sat back, hands trembling, the journal splayed open before me like wounds. The weight of it hit me then, not just the horror of what had been done, but the staggering depth of the cover-up. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was generational rot, a conspiracy that had survived not by violence, but by inertia, passed down like a family heirloom of silence. Horace had tried to stop it. He'd failed. And now, somehow, I had stepped into his shoes. I returned the journals to the hidden recess, but scanned every page into my laptop, double-backed them to a cloud server, encrypted everything. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I believed deeply that someone out there still wanted this buried. The town's silence wasn't just cultural, it was enforced. And now I had names, dates, evidence. I wasn't just auditing a property. I was holding a match to a century-old powder keg. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the flickering flame of a gas lantern, the journals closed beside me, and asked myself a question I hadn't dared until now. What if I don't make it out of here? What if the names in these journals still had descendants? What if those descendants had inherited more than wealth? What if they had inherited the duty to protect the lie, no matter the cost? I thought of David Lang, the missing clerk, of the people in town who wouldn't speak, of the waitress's narrowed eyes and the librarian's evasions. I thought of Horace Miro, locked inside his own estate, scribbling warnings into the pages of books no one was supposed to find. And then I thought of the last line again. No justice can come from silence, and no silence comes without cost. I didn't know it yet, but the cost was coming, and I had already begun to pay IT. IT happened on the third night after discovering the journals, just after midnight, when the house had again settled into that unsettling hush, not the comforting silence of rest, but the eerie pause of something holding its breath. I had exhausted every page of Horace Miro's writing, memorized the curve of his panic, and I couldn't stop thinking about the final words he left behind, that the court order had been hidden, sealed, buried somewhere only the eyes that understand guilt will find it. It wasn't a riddle. It was a dare. And I couldn't sleep knowing it might still be somewhere within the walls, unseen and untouched for over a century. I moved through the estate like a man possessed, flashlight in hand, mapping out every possible space Horace could have concealed something that damning. The study had already yielded its secret. The library was too exposed. The basement was too wet, too damaged. But the attic, high, remote, forgotten, hadn't yet been explored. I found the narrow door behind a crooked bookshelf in the upstairs hallway, half concealed by moth-eaten drapes, and the rusted latch groaned in protest as I forced it open. A rush of cold air met me, and the wooden stairs protested with each step as I climbed into the gloom. The attic was choked with cobwebs and dust, so thick it felt like ash. Broken furniture, boxes sealed with yellow tape, old trunks warped by time. I searched methodically, guided by instinct more than reason, knocking on floorboards, tapping at the walls, brushing aside decades of decay. It was only by accident that I noticed a gap beneath the window frame, no wider than a palm, just enough to hint at a hollow space beneath the floorboards. I pried one up with a crowbar taken from the tool shed and found, nestled inside a rotting recess, a rusted metal box the size of a legal folder, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with rotted leather strap. My fingers shook as I lifted it. The weight alone told me this wasn't memorabilia. This was purpose. I carried it downstairs, heart pounding, and placed it on the dining table under the harsh beam of my lantern. The strap fell apart as I unwrapped the cloth, revealing the box's corroded latch. It opened with a reluctant screech, and inside, encased in time and must, was a sheaf of papers, official documents, yellow but intact, bearing the seal of the state Supreme Court and stamped with a date, October 12, 1889. The top page was a petition of probate suspension and investigation into the Miro Family Trust, filed by the Willard family's legal counsel. The allegations were explosive: falsification of inheritance documentation, undue influence, witness intimidation, even suspected homicide. The language was blunt, uncompromising, and deadly precise. Supporting pages contained notarized testimonies from former employees, drafts of the original Miro patriarch's will, and correspondence between judges and private agents hinting at bribes and coercion. My hands went numb as I turned the pages. This was the missing piece. This was what Horace had hidden. It wasn't just that his family had stolen this estate. They had done so under the shield of power, protected by a legal system complicit in its own corruption. But as I reached the final page, something changed. The last document in the bundle was a sealed affidavit, separate from the rest, unfiled, unstamped, an addendum, perhaps, or a dying confession. I opened it slowly, and the moment my eyes landed on the page, my breath caught in my throat. It was written in a careful hand, and dated only a few days after the court order was composed. The letter was from a clerk who had helped draft the case, a man named Elias Ward, who claimed he'd been pressured into silence by Miro agents but had kept a personal record of the case, in the hopes that one day someone would finish what we could not. I read on, transfixed. Elias detailed how he had been warned repeatedly to stop pursuing the case. Then his brother went missing. Then his own house was burned. And then, buried in the final paragraph, came the name that froze the blood in my veins. I have reason to believe that Henry Tolliver, the newly appointed junior clerk, was among those also intimidated, possibly blackmailed. I regret not protecting him more. He was a good man. Tolliver, my grandfather's grandfather. I reread the name a dozen times, trying to reconcile the word on the page with the man in the black and white photographs of my childhood home. A stern face, weathered hands, always described as a man who valued order above all else. I had never known more than that. Family history had never been discussed beyond vague stories of starting over and leaving old places behind. But now, staring at the page, my mind was on fire. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't just another job. I had been sent to Miro Estate not by chance, but by a force deeper and crueler than fate, a lineage of silence, a bloodline that had once been witness to this conspiracy and had done nothing to stop it. My great-great-grandfather had been there. He had been in the room when the order was drafted, and then he had vanished. His name never listed again in court rolls, his residence marked as relocated. Now I understood why. Now I understood the weight I had always felt when entering courthouses, the bitterness I couldn't quite name when reading falsified documents, the strange, irrational sense of guilt I carried in rooms full of silence. It was inherited. It was legacy, and it had led me straight into the belly of the beast. I sat there for hours, the court order spread before me, the affidavit still trembling in my hand, staring at the signature that bound my family to this century-old secret. The emotions came in waves: shock, disbelief, anger, shame. I thought about the years I'd spent cleaning up other people's financial messes, always with a sense of detachment, a mechanical precision that insulated me from the damage. But this wasn't someone else's story. This was mine. My blood, my name, my inheritance, not of wealth, but of cowardice, complicity, and silence. I had to walk outside. The air felt unbreathable inside the estate. I stumbled out into the night, the cold biting against my skin, the trees watching like sentinels. I wanted to scream, but even that felt futile. I sat on the crumbling stone bench, the court order in a folder clutched against my chest, and I asked myself the hardest question yet. What now? If I reported it, would anyone care? Would it disappear into bureaucracy, just as it had in 1889? If I stayed silent, what kind of man would that make me? Just another link in the chain? And if I pushed forward, if I forced this truth into the light, what would it cost me? Would I vanish like David Lang? Would I lose everything, just as Horace had feared? There were no good answers, only the unbearable weight of responsibility. The order had survived, somehow, and now it was in my hands. And as the moon cast its pale light across the overgrown lawn, I understood that I had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The story was no longer about the mere Rose. It was about me. The audit was over. The reckoning had begun. The next morning broke without sunlight, just a heavy gray smear across the sky, as if the world itself had decided not to fully wake. I stood at the kitchen sink, gripping a chipped coffee mug like it was an anchor, staring out at the garden that had once been meticulously manicured and was now little more than a jungle of broken hedgerows and sagging trellises. The court order lay sealed in my bag, and with it, the letter that had detonated my understanding of my own name, Tolliver. I had always considered my surname a footnote in history, a bland echo of ancestry that held no real sway over who I was. But now I couldn't shake the weight of it. Couldn't stop hearing the rustle of those old papers, the crisp pen strokes of a man I had never met but somehow knew in my bones. Henry Tolliver, junior clerk, witness, participant, victim? I didn't know. What I did know was that I couldn't move forward without digging deeper into my own bloodline. I needed to know what happened to Henry, where he had gone, and why his name had vanished so completely from every record after 1889. I drove to the Linvale Historical Society again, this time with a clear purpose and the grim clarity of someone peeling back their own skin. Mrs. Abernathy seemed surprised to see me, and even more surprised when I asked for access to the town's full family registries. "Looking for someone in particular?" she asked, her pen pausing mid-note. I nodded, swallowing the dry knot in my throat. Henry Tolliver, clerk, late 1880s. She blinked, her expression unreadable. "That name's not been mentioned here in years," she said slowly, rising to unlock the archives cabinet behind her. "He wasn't from Linvale, but he lived here for a time. Briefly, disappeared like so many others." That phrase again. Disappeared. It was beginning to sound less like misfortune and more like ritual. She handed me a brittle ledger, and I traced my fingers down the pages until I found him. Tolliver Henry J., residence listed at 12 Homestead Lane, occupation. Junior court clerk, unmarried, no children. Last notation, relocated March 1890. No destination listed. Just gone. But as I turned the page, something caught my eye, a marginal note written in pencil, faint but legible. See correspondence. J. Reams, postmaster. I turned to Mrs. Abernathy. "Who's Reams?" She pursed her lips. "Jonathan Reams. He was Linvale's postmaster during that time. Kept meticulous records, diaries, letters, logs. Most of them were donated to us when he died." She led me to a separate shelf where boxes lined the wall in faded archival sleeves. It took nearly an hour of combing through yellowed envelopes and handwritten letters before I found it. A sealed envelope labeled Tolliver H. March 1890. The letter inside was short, addressed from Henry to his younger sister, and written in a nervous, erratic hand. The ink was faded, but the words were unmistakable. "Mary, if you receive this, know that I did my best to tell the truth. I stood before them, judges, lawyers, men with power, and I gave my statement. But I could see then, as clear as the ink on this page, that it would never leave the room. The order will not be filed. They've told me to leave Linvale. No protection. No future here. I'm going west under a different name. Do not try to find me. Do not mention this again." It was signed hastily, without flourish. H. My breath caught. He had tried. He had tried to be more than a witness. He had tried to be a voice. And the system had swallowed him whole. I copied the letter and stared at the signature for a long time, thinking about the Tolliver men who came after him. my grandfather, my father, and now me, none of us aware that we were walking to the world with this wound beneath our feet. It wasn't just guilt that I felt. It was grief. Grief for a man whose life had been snuffed out by silence, whose legacy had been hidden not by dust or time, but by design. I drove straight to the Linvale Cemetery, on the off chance that some record remained, some clue about where Henry had gone. But there was no stone, no marker, no Tolliver plot, just row after row of weathered headstones bearing the names of families who had stayed, who had mattered, who had been allowed to be remembered. I stood there among them, my coat clinging to me in the damp breeze, and felt more orphaned than I ever had. It struck me, then, that this was the true price of the Miro conspiracy. Not just wealth stolen, not just justice denied, but identities erased, lineages shattered, generations born into silence with no idea what they'd inherited. I had been living in that silence my whole life. It had shaped me in ways I never understood. My obsession with precision, my retreat from relationships, my unease around authority. Now I saw for what it was, a legacy of fear. Back at the estate, I began comparing the names in the court order to those in the town's registries. I discovered that many of the surnames had quietly prospered in Linvale, families that had maintained power, influence, land, descendants of the very men Horace had written about. Not all of them, but enough to make me understand that this wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. The crimes had become tradition. The victims had become myths. And the estate had become a monument to every lie they'd buried. I thought of my father then, a man who never spoke of his past, who worked 12-hour shifts in silence and died with more regrets than words. Had he known? Had the story been passed down in shadows, whispering corners, and then forgotten? Or had he lived, like me, never knowing that his blood carried the weight of betrayal? I'll never know. But I do know this. I could no longer separate myself from what I had found. I wasn't just an auditor anymore. I was an heir not to wealth or land, but to a moment in history that demanded justice. Henry Tolliver had written his letter in fear. I would write mine in defiance. I spent the next 2 days compiling everything. Scans of the order, the affidavit, the journals, the letter from Henry. I backed them up in multiple locations, encrypted them, printed physical copies. I began drafting a statement of record, detailing what I had uncovered and how I had found it. I knew I couldn't trust the local courthouse. I would send it to investigative journalists, legal historians, civil rights organizations, anyone who might still care. But even as I worked, I felt the house watching, not in a spectral sense, but in the way old buildings do when you're trespassing against their purpose. The Miro estate wasn't built for truth. It was built to contain it. And now I had broken the seal. The silence was gone. The storm was coming. The first real sign that I wasn't alone came not in the form of confrontation, but erasure. I noticed it one evening when I logged into my email account from the library's public terminal, my laptop battery dead, and the estate's power still unreliable. The folder where I'd stored backups of the scanned court order and affidavit, gone. Not moved, not renamed, deleted, without access logs. My heart pounded as I clicked through other folders, discovering that more than half of the documents I'd uploaded during my stay in Linvale were missing. I checked the cloud backups. 2 of the 3 were still intact, but one had been breached and locked with a password I hadn't set. That night, back at the estate, I tore open the remaining journals, checking for signs of tampering. Everything seemed untouched, but something had changed. The air felt thinner, more watched. I began locking the door at night, propping chairs against the knob. Rationally, I knew no one had broken in. Irrationally, I knew they didn't have to. Whatever I had stirred wasn't simply dormant. It was patrolled. The next day, I approached Harold, the librarian, with a more direct request. I wanted town records showing appointments to civic offices over the past 100 years. Sheriffs, judges, council members, clerks. At first, he hesitated. Then, without a word, he led me into the back room and unlocked a second drawer I hadn't noticed before. "You're not the first," he said, handing me a binder thick with old typewritten rosters. "But you might be the last." The words landed like a stone in my chest. I asked him what he meant, but he shook his head. People disappear when they ask questions, or they stop asking altogether. Easy that way. Over the next 4 hours, I constructed a map of names, those who had positions of influence in Linvale, decade after decade. It was a carousel of repetition. The same surnames resurface again and again: Ellis, Braith, Morgan, Du Bois. They weren't just residents, they were stewards, custodians of silence. And though I had no direct proof, I was now certain that these families had profited from the theft of the Miro fortune, or at least from the town's willful amnesia. They were the inheritors of a pact made in shadow, a silent agreement that truth was a threat, and silent a form of civic duty. The implication was terrifying, not because it meant I was being watched, but because it meant I had already been absorbed into the machine. Collins, my supervisor at the firm, had given me this assignment like a man passing off a cursed object, not with malice, but with relief. He knew, or had known enough to never open the box. And now I was in the box, crawling around its corners, looking for seams. At Merriweather's diner, I tried again to press the woman at the counter. Her name was Ruth. I'd finally learned for anything about the estate. "I know you're afraid," I said quietly, "but I found the order, the original. Horace tried to file it. It was real." Her eyes flicked toward me, then away. "You shouldn't say that here," she muttered. "Why?" I asked. "Because the walls have ears." "No," she said, her voice like gravel. "Because people have mouths, and some of them still speak to the wrong ones." I left cash on the counter and walked out, feeling 100 invisible threads tug at my spine. Outside, a man across the street stood beside a parked truck, watching me. Not overtly, not with menace, just with knowledge. I'd begun to recognize the look, like I was part of something now, whether I wanted to be or not. Back at the estate, I reviewed my notes and journal entries, detailing everything I'd learned: the cover-up, the names, the compromise files. It was no longer a question of uncovering the truth. I had it. The problem now was what to do with it. Every attempt to contact outside help, legal aid, investigative journalists, advocacy groups, either bounced or went unanswered. A call to a law professor I'd met years ago was returned with a curt voicemail. "Stop. You don't know who you're dealing with." That night, I took the court order into town and made 5 photocopies, sealing each in an envelope marked confidential, addressing them to different offices in different states. I didn't trust digital anymore. I needed paper, something that couldn't be hacked, only intercepted by hand. But even as I sealed the envelopes, I saw Harold's face in my mind. "You might be the last." I mailed them the next morning, watching the box swallow my efforts without ceremony. The silence that followed was crushing. No calls, no acknowledgments, just a lingering dread and the increasing certainty that the town knew, not just about the estate, but about me. I noticed the gas station clerk no longer made eye contact. The general store started closing 15 minutes earlier. A maintenance truck followed me twice as I drove the perimeter roads. None of it was aggressive. It was quiet, coordinated, consistent. A message: I wasn't welcome. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. I drove to the edge of town one evening, parked at a viewpoint overlooking the valley, and sat with the engine running. I could leave. I could call it in, submit my report with a redacted summary, walk away with a clean conscience and plausible deniability. People had done it before me. People who knew and chose to forget. But as I stared out over the treetops, the thought of Henry's letter post behind my eyes: "Do not try to find me. Do not mention this again." That had been the price he paid for speaking up. Silence in exile. Anonymity in fear. If I left now, I would inherit the same wound. And I couldn't carry it. Not anymore. I returned to the state and printed everything again, this time assembling a full dossier. Timeline, evidence, summary, names. I labeled it Miro Deposition Draft and placed it in the safe beneath the stairs, along with a handwritten letter explaining everything. If something happened to me, this would be found. Or it wouldn't. Either way, it was the best I could do. That night, I slept for 3 hours. Fitful, shallow. I dreamed of rows of empty chairs in a courtroom with no walls, of a gavel striking nothing, of names being spoken and erased all at once. The next morning, the wind had shifted, colder, sharper, the kind of weather that presses against your ribs and makes you feel temporary. I stood at the estate's gate, looking down the long gravel drive, and realized something else. The town didn't need to threaten me. They'd already beaten me. With silence, with the impossibility of response, with agreements made long before I was born and upheld by men whose portraits now hung in city halls and courthouses, staring down with eyes that had never been held accountable. I could scream. I could write. I could file and petition and fight. But unless someone listened, I was just another echo in a room built to absorb them. And yet, I wasn't done. Not why IT was Ruth in the diner, who slipped me the note. No words, no glance. Just a folded square of receipt paper tucked beneath my mug the morning after I'd mailed the documents. I opened it with trembling fingers. Retired clerk, Jasper Lane. Ask for Mr. Downing. Don't tell anyone you're coming. That was it. I read it twice before pocketing it, feeling the sudden weight of urgency settle on my chest. A name, a direction, a crack in the wall. I drove out to Jasper Lane later that afternoon, an aging road near the edge of town lined with small, unremarkable houses sagging beneath decades of deferred maintenance. Number 18 looked no different. Its shutters crooked, the porch uneven, wind chimes clinking dully in the breeze. I parked a block away and walked. Every step felt like it echoed through time, through layers of silence and unseen eyes. I knocked, gently at first, then again. The door opened with a groan, revealing a thin, pale man in his late 80s, oxygen tubing strapped beneath his nose, and trembling hands gripping a walker. His eyes, however, were razor-sharp. He looked at me as if he'd been expecting me. "You the one digging at the estate?" he rasped. I nodded. He stepped aside. "Come in. I've only got so long left, and it ain't gonna go to waste." The inside of his house smelled of paper and sickness, and every flat surface was covered in folders, envelopes, and faded photographs. He motioned for me to sit, then lowered himself slowly into the chair opposite, wincing as he adjusted the nasal cannula. "Name's Leonard Downing," he said. "Retired records clerk. Linvale Courthouse. Started in '67. Retired in '03. That was the last time I saw anyone walk to the Miro case files. You want to know what happened to David Lang?" I leaned in. "Yes, more than anything." He gave a bitter laugh that turned into a ragged cough. "Then buckle in, son, because what you're about to hear don't come from ghosts. It comes from men. Ugly, ordinary men." He reached into a cabinet and pulled out a box, from which he drew a worn leather journal and an envelope sealed with wax. Lang found the same things you did. He was good, too good, found the old court order tucked into a mislabeled ledger, flagged it, and submitted a request for review. He paused. 3 days later, his request vanished from the system. So, did he? Vanished. I asked. Gone. No warning. His car was found by the river, but no body. Sheriff called it suicide. Town nodded, but we all knew better. Someone got to him. I don't know who pulled the strings, but I know which families wanted it gone. Same names every time. He pushed the journal toward me. "That's mine. I started keeping it after Lang disappeared, just in case." I opened it and found page after page of careful entries, names, dates, court file numbers, transfer requests, suspicious disappearances, blocked audits. It was all there, the machinery, the maintenance of silence. "You ever try to expose it?" I asked. He laughed again, a wheezing sound that seemed to hurt. "Tried? Hell no. I had a wife. 2 kids. I wasn't going to vanish like Lang. But I kept it. And I waited." He looked at me hard. Waited for someone dumb enough or brave enough to finish what Horace started. The envelope, he explained, contained a notarized confession, his own, signed and dated, ready to be released upon his death. "I'm too old for games. But you might just be young enough to still believe in right and wrong. So here, do something with it before they make you disappear too." I took the envelope with reverence, a kind of sacred weight in my hand. His eyes softened for a moment. "You got family?" I nodded. "Then be smart. They'll come for you sideways." Not with guns. With discrediting, with character attacks, with job loss. They don't need to kill you to make you disappear. They just need to make you stop matching. I swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying, he said simply. And I ain't going out carrying someone else's guilt. He didn't ask me to leave, but I stood and did, so anyway, the confession sealed and clutched to my chest like it was the last warm thing in the world. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the clouds hung lower than ever, a sky heavy with unfinished business. I drove straight to the state and locked myself in, paranoia thick as smoke. I scanned the confession, added it to the dossier, then packed everything into a fireproof case. I placed it beneath the floorboard in the study, the same spot where Horace had once hidden the journals. And then, for the first time since arriving, I sat in the estate's front hall and cried. Not out of fear, not even out of grief, but from the unbearable truth that this man, Leonard Downing, had carried a secret for over half a century, not because he was evil or cowardly, but because silence had become the currency of survival, because silence was safer than justice. And now that silence was mine to break. The next morning, I returned to his house. A white coroner's van sat parked outside. He had died overnight. The timing was no coincidence. Life is a cruel way of waiting until your last breath to open its doors. I stood across the street, invisible to the medics wheeling him out under a tarp, and I whispered a promise. I will not let this be for nothing. But even as I spoke the words, I knew I was no longer safe, that I sent the dossier every place I could think of. The morning after Leonard Downing died, I drove to a nearby town with a FedEx office and mailed 4 priority packages. One to the state attorney general, one to a respected investigative journalist based in Chicago, one to a civil rights legal firm known for reopening cold cases, and one to an archival law professor who had once guest lectured at my university. Each included a personalized cover letter, a full timeline of the Miro fraud, scanned exhibits, Downing's confession, Horace's journals, and my sworn statement. I returned to Linvale not with hope, but with the fragile dignity of someone who had done the right thing regardless of outcome. But the outcome came quickly, and it was silence. At first, I thought it was delay, mail getting lost, admin processing. But after 2 weeks, I began following up. My emails bounced from the legal firm server with a vague error. The professor's assistant replied coldly that her employer was unavailable for correspondence and that unsolicited materials had been disposed of per policy. The journalist never responded. I left messages. I sent follow-ups. Nothing. When I called the Attorney General's public inquiry line, I was transferred twice and then hung up on after waiting 40 minutes on hold. Something wasn't right. It was too clean, too coordinated, like I'd sent the truth into a system designed to swallow it whole. One night, I drove 3 hours to the nearest city and visited the firm's physical address. Their receptionist politely informed me they had no record of receiving any parcel under my name. She looked genuinely confused until I mentioned the words Miro Estate. Then her expression changed, a quiet tightening, a slight lean backward, and then the rehearsed response. I'm sorry, sir. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. We cannot help you. That phrase echoed in my ears all the way back to Linvale. We cannot help you. Not we don't believe you. Not we think you're wrong. Just a simple acknowledgement that they knew and were choosing not to act. When I returned to the estate, I discovered the front door ajar. Nothing was stolen. Nothing visibly moved. But the lock was scratched, as if someone had picked it and entered without urgency. I checked the floorboard in the study. The fireproof case was untouched. But the envelope I had left on top, labeled duplicates, do not remove, was gone. Whoever came in didn't want the originals. They wanted me to know they'd been here, that they could be here whenever they chose. The air inside the house grew heavier by the hour, like something old and relentless had turned its eyes toward me. And not just me. My phone rang the next morning. My sister, in tears. Someone had called her husband's office and asked questions about my mental health. Claimed I was in trouble, possibly suicidal, that I'd been sending disturbing documents. I hadn't spoken to her in over a month. Now her husband's company was involved. They didn't identify themselves, just left enough concern to rattle the cage. Then it happened again. My landlord from back home called. Someone had come by asking if I'd broken my lease. Left a card with no name. A neighbor said they saw two men parked outside my apartment building. My mail had been tampered with. I was being boxed in, not by guns, not by threats, but by erasure. It was happening in slow motion, one layer at a time, making me look unstable, making me question whether I had any allies left. Even at the firm, Colin stopped responding to my messages. I checked the employee portal. My profile was no longer listed, terminated due to non-response. A lie. I had received no warning, no call, no notice, just gone. I called the HR line and was told there was no record of my employment at that office. When I demanded to speak to Collins, the line went dead. I stared at the receiver for 10 minutes, paralyzed. My career was gone, my record scrubbed, my name disappearing from the institutions I had trusted. And through it all, the state stood unmoved, still and crumbling, the heart of the infection that had spread through every corridor of my life. I drove to the courthouse again, clutching the affidavit, the last remaining original. I asked to speak to a judge, anyone on the probate board. I waited 4 hours before being told there were no appointment available. I demanded to leave. A statement. The receptionist smiled gently and pointed to a box marked inquiries. I dropped the letter in and watched it vanish into the slot, as if watching my voice fall into a well. I waited a week. Nothing. No call. No acknowledgement. The clerk I'd spoken to no longer worked there, they said. I began checking news sites obsessively, hoping one of my letters had leaked, hoping someone somewhere had decided to care. But the stories remained the same. Distractions, noise, static. The Miro estate didn't exist. Not in the world that decided what was real. And so I sat, day after day, staring at the stack of documents on the table, trying to find the crack I'd missed. But there was none. I had everything. I had the truth. And it was useless, like throwing stones into the ocean. The house began to feel like a cell. I stopped sleeping. I stopped shaving. My reflection blurred in the dust-streaked mirrors. Some days I forgot what I had eaten. I didn't dare leave the estate for too long. Not when the town watched. Not when every whisper might be a warning. I passed Ruth on the sidewalk one evening. Her expression stricken, sympathetic. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She had tried. They all had. But the town didn't belong to individuals anymore. It belonged to the agreement. The oldest kind. The one where everyone keeps their place. And the truth is the one thing no one owns. And I had broken it. Alone. The discovery came not from persistence, but from surrender. I had stopped searching actively, having burned through every floorboard, drawer, and false panel I could find in the Miro estate without sleep, without clarity. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a trance, a slow deterioration of will and identity. I moved through the house like a ghost of myself, haunted not by the estate, but by the sheer futility of having exposed something no one would claim, as if truth had always been just another room in this house, locked, sealed, and ignored. I had resigned myself to a bitter understanding that the story would die with me, just like it had with Horace, just like it nearly had with Leonard, just like it had for every soul that had tried to name it. But it was on the 7th day of rain, when the ceilings had started to leak and the smell of rot had returned to the lower corridor, that I opened the western sitting room closet in a rare moment of absent-mindedness, thinking only to search for something dry to drape across a drafty window. Inside was a stack of mildewed linens, and behind them, buried near the floor, a cedar box I hadn't noticed in any prior sweep. It wasn't locked, just stuck. It took both hands to pry it open. Inside was an envelope sealed in wax with faded crest, a tree encircled by a snake, the Miro family emblem I'd seen carved above the study mantel. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, folded between thick parchment pages, was the last will and testament of Reginald Miro, dated March 1885. I sat down on the floor right there in the damp and read it once, then twice, then again, my vision blurring with disbelief. This was the original will, not a copy, not a draft. the one that should have determined the fate of the estate. And it was damning. It left nothing to Horace. Not the land, not the accounts, not the rail shares. Instead, the entirety of the Miro estate, every asset, every holding, every last shilling, had been intended to transfer into a charitable trust. Specifically, the Miro Children's Sanctuary, an institution that never existed. It was to be built on estate grounds and run by trustees independent of the Miro bloodline, with instructions to serve orphaned and displaced children from surrounding counties. The language was explicit. Should any Miro heir attempt to revoke or reassign these holdings, let this document serve as testament that such actions be considered fraudulent and morally void. I blinked down at the seal, the signature, the notarization mark, and felt the last threads of denial snap. The will had been hidden because it would have unmade everything. The Miro fortune wasn't supposed to exist. The lineage of wealth that had governed Linvale for generations was rooted not in prosperity, but in theft. The estate should have been dissolved, the land repurposed for good. Instead, Horace, gripped by entitlement, fear, or pressure, had destroyed the future his father envisioned and rewritten the legacy as one of rot. And the rest of them, judges, lawyers, bankers, had gone along with it, had forged new documents, filed new wills, threatened witnesses, and buried this one in a linen box, sealed behind damp fabric in a house built on silence. I sat on the warped floorboard with the will in my lap, overwhelmed not by rage or triumph, but by grief. Real, crushing grief for what could have been, for the children who never had a sanctuary, for the men who spent their lives protecting a lie, for Horace, who had died insane with guilt, for Henry, who had vanished into history, for Leonard, who had waited too long to speak, for every life that had passed through Linvale without knowing that the town's cobbled streets and aging storefronts were built atop an orphanage that never existed. I thought of my own childhood, the quiet nights and unspoken tensions, the weight my father had carried without words. I thought of the first time I'd stood in this house, just another cog in a machine meant to settle debts, unaware that I was walking into a mausoleum for hope. And then I stood, the will still clutched in my hands, and I knew what I had to do, not just for the record, not just for the audit, but because this document wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a map to an unbuilt future, a future denied by greed and cemented by a century of complicity. I scanned it, photographed it, filed it alongside the court order and the confession. But this time, I did something different. I walked into town. I entered the courthouse. I requested an appointment with a sitting judge. Not a call, not a submission, but a physical meeting. And when they asked me for my name, I gave it without hesitation. When they told me it could be a 2-week wait, I said I'd sit there every day until someone listened. And then I took out the will and placed it on the counter. And I said, this has been buried for 140 years. I'm not asking anymore. The clerk stared at me. She didn't speak, but she picked up the phone and dialed an internal extension. The rest of the conversation happened in hushed tones. I was told to wait in a side room. I sat there for an hour, then 2, clutching the file with knuckles gone white. Finally, a woman in a navy suit entered the room and sat across from me. She introduced herself as an attorney with the Probate Review Board. She didn't ask how I got the will. She just looked at it for a long time, then nodded almost imperceptibly. This will cause a storm, she said softly. It already has, I replied. She flipped through the pages, her face unreadable. And what do you want exactly? I looked her dead in the eye. I want the Miro estate seized. I want a public investigation. I want every name in that court order read into the record. And I want this town to remember the children it forgot. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't argue. She stood, nodded once, and walked out with the file. I didn't leave the courthouse that night. I stayed in town, holed up in a motel room, waiting for the knock I knew would come. And it did, but not from an agent of the law. It came from something older, something quieter. The town itself, rearranging its silence in preparation for the storm I had unleashed. It's one thing to find the truth. It's another thing to carry it, to drag it behind you like a broken body, while the world keeps walking past, pretending it doesn't see. I woke the next morning in a motel room with flickering lights and the smell of bleach in the air, the kind of place that forgets you the moment you check in. I lay still for a long time, listening to the traffic roll past on the highway, feeling the weight of the file no longer beneath my pillow. It had been taken the day before, willingly, finally, handed over not in hope but in defiance. And now, all I had was silence again, a different silence, one that hummed with consequence. I checked my email. Nothing. Phone? No calls. No threats. No validation. Just the quiet of a world that hadn't decided whether to let the truth live or bury it again. I went for coffee in a nearby diner and caught a segment on the local news. Nothing about the Miro estate. Nothing about the will. Just road closures and high school football scores. I stirred sugar into my cup with fingers that shook harder than I'd admit. I kept expecting something to happen. I thought I'd feel relieved, vindicated, triumphant, but all I felt was exposed, because now I'd chosen my side. There was no middle ground anymore. If they tried to silence me now, they'd have to do it loudly, and I realized that was the only thing keeping me safe. Not justice, not the law. Noise and visibility. I drove back to the estate, not because I wanted to be there, but because I needed to gather the final pieces, the journals, the correspondence, the scanned backups stored on hard drives hidden in the wall, every physical trace I could preserve. The place looked different now, less haunted, not because it wasn't still rotting from the inside out, but because I no longer feared it. It wasn't a monster. It was evidence, a witness made of brick and wood, a story no longer able to lie. I spent the day boxing everything up, labeling, cross-referencing, documenting. I uploaded the files to a secure server and drafted an open letter, not to the courts, not to the firms, but to the people. I titled it, A Sanctuary That Never Was, The Truth About the Miro Estate. I wrote it in one sitting, 15 pages. No edits, no euphemisms, just the truth, names, dates, scans, confessions, ledgers, testimony, and most importantly, the will. I sent it to newspapers, blogs, academics, anonymous forums, anyone who might care. And then I published it under my full name. I knew what that meant. I knew it could end everything, my career, my anonymity, my safety, but that was a decision I made. To stand on the other side of silence, even if no one followed. That night, I didn't return to the motel. I stayed in the estate one last time, sitting in the same chair where Horace had written his last words. I poured a glass of aged whiskey I found buried in the pantry and toasted no one in particular. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a martyr. I was a man who stumbled into a grave and refused to lie down in it. At sunrise, I stood outside and watched the first reporters arrive. They didn't speak to me at first, just took photos, hovered. One young woman from a regional outlet finally approached me and asked, "Are you the one who leaked the story?" I nodded. She didn't ask why, just scribbled something and walked away. By noon, there were cameras, trucks, protesters, activists, locals with signs demanding answers. It had begun. The noise, the storm. But in the middle of it, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, heart hammering. A voice, calm, older, female. "Mr. Tolliver, we received your report. We are opening a federal inquiry. You've done the right thing." And that was it. One sentence. The system creaking open a sliver. Not wide enough for justice to walk through, but wide enough for hope. I stood there watching the estate finally speak. Not through ghosts or legends, but through headlines and cameras and voices loud enough to be heard past Linvale's borders. I was no longer alone. I was no longer silent. And for the first time in over a century, the truth was louder than the lie. It's been 4 months since the story broke, and I still dream about the estate. Its warped floorboards, its dust-choked air, the way the light used to hang in the hall like breath held too long. The federal inquiry is underway now, though I no longer receive updates. Once the news cycle moved on, so did the urgency. The first few weeks were a blur. Press conferences, interviews, investigators combing the house with gloves and flashlights, news trucks parked along the gravel road like vultures around a carcass. The will was authenticated. The journals verified. Horace Miro's legacy laid bare for anyone who cared to read the PDF files that circled the internet like digital ghosts. There were hearings, depositions. Some of the descendants of the families named in the court order came forward with statements of disassociation, while others hired lawyers and refused to speak. A few resigned quietly from town offices. Others doubled down, denying everything, calling it historical fiction, a witch hunt against legacy. A portion of the estate has now been roped off as a preservation site, slated for demolition and reconstruction. There's talk of finally building the children's sanctuary Reginald Miro intended. Over a century late, but with a kind of irony that makes your stomach turn instead of swell with hope. The land that should have sheltered the lost will now be named after the man whose son buried that vision beneath decades of silence. I've been asked to speak at the dedication ceremony. I won't go. I've given everything I could already. There's nothing left to give. My name is now a matter of public record, synonymous with the story, the scandal, the fall of Linvale's inherited power. Some call me a whistleblower, others a traitor. Some just nod, offer condolences they don't mean, as if I'd survived some kind of war. But it wasn't a war. It was a slow bleed, a quiet reckoning. And the wound is still open. I've lost my job. No firm wants to hire a man with liability sewn into his reputation, even if what I exposed was real. I live in a one-bedroom apartment now, far from Linvale, working part-time for a nonprofit that doesn't ask too many questions. I don't miss this state. I miss who I was before I stepped inside it. Before I opened a box and found a name that had always belonged to me. Before I realized my family had once stood on the edge of courage and stepped back into the dark. People asked if it was worth it, if I'd do it again. And the truth is, I don't know. I didn't do it to be brave. I did it because I couldn't carry the silence anymore. I did it because I saw Henry Tolliver's name vanish in the margins of the ledger and felt something inside me scream to be heard. I did it because I needed to know that my name didn't mean complicity, that I could be something else, something better. And maybe that's the only justice we get, not in courts or headlines or press releases, but in the choice to be different from those who came before us, to let the truth live, even when no one's asking for it. The estate still stands, though most of its windows are boarded now. The town avoids it. Reporters visit sometimes, but less and less. The story is no longer urgent, just history. And history, as I've learned, is whatever survives the forgetting. I still receive emails. Some are from strangers thanking me. Others from people with stories of their own estates, their own secrets tucked away in dry cellars and probate archives, waiting for someone brave or foolish, enough to open the right drawer. They ask what to do, how to start. I never know what to tell them. I can't promise safety. I can't promise resolution. All I can promise is that truth, once known, is its own burden. It will not let you go. It will follow you, shape you, demand things from you, but it will also free you. And that's what I carry with me now. Not pride, not vindication, but freedom. The kind that comes from walking out a house and knowing it didn't keep you. The kind that comes from saying, this is what happened, this is what they tried to bury, and this is what remains.